We're back and we're in the Encyclopedia of the Ancient World again. And we're going to kind of finish up the 18th dynasty and get into the 19th dynasty. And specifically, the main part of this is going to be talking about King Tut, okay? But at the end of, you remember the 18th dynasty, the last we were talking about Akhenaten's years, okay? And when he was transitioning out, it was a very confusing time. He left Egypt in a very confusing time, and the records are extremely unclear as to what happened with the transition and what was going on. We know that there was a Smenkare, but we're not exactly sure who they were. Who is it? We're not sure. Maybe a male co-ruler, possibly Nefertiti, which was his first queen, co-ruling under a male name. We're not sure. We do know that in 1907, they found a mummy buried in the Valley of the Kings, and its tomb labeled KV55. It was so fragile that it completely fell apart. It was a mystery, but it was a male body, but we're not sure. Was it Smenkhare? Was it Akhenaten? We're not sure. What we are sure of is that after them comes Tutankhamun to the throne. He is only 9 years old, roughly. He's the son of Akhenaten and Kia, his second wife. And there's a daughter, and they married to Tut, okay? His reign, he moves back to Thebes. He has many advisors that are done with the Akhenaten's religion, and they go back to normal. He changes his name from Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. So at this point, they're transitioning back from the new god forced on them by Amenhotep from Aten to Amun. And so they go back to Amun-Ra, declaring the principal god once more. So they're claiming he is, again, the ultimate god and needs to be worshipped, and everything is going back to the way it was. However, King Tut completely relies on his advisors due to his age. One of his main advisors was a guy named A.Y. He was a commander of the chariots. He was a principal advisor. And unfortunately, King Tut started at 9. He ruled 10 years, but that only makes him 19, and he dies. And he dies without any sons. So then you have, this chief advisor with him, and his name is right? And his name is Akhenaten, which is Tut's widow, and she is trying to figure out how to reign. She wants to reign, she's looking to reign, but there's not any men in the lineage to marry. So she sends a letter to the Hittite king and says, I don't want to marry a servant. And at this point, we think she's referring to the eye. So, however, the king that she's sending to him that the Hittites are sending to her, rather, are killed in transit. So we don't know. The other possibility for why there's not a suitable husband for her is that there was a plague. And that would cause a short of his husband, as many of the Ethiopians or the Egyptians and the Hittites are all dying. And eventually, all of Akhenaten's daughters disappear without a trace. So eventually, she is killed, and reigns for just 4 years. And then we have Horemheb, who is a powerful army general. Okay, he's a very ruthless man, and possibly he murdered the Hittite prince that was being sent down to the queen in his initial planning stages of trying to take the throne. He attempts to rename all the signs of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and from memory. He tries to just remove everything, get rid of it all, and tries to destroy their statues. He's trying to, get rid of any sign of them, and trying to, I think, eliminate that lineage so that his lineage would be the only one that's there. He reigns for 28 years. He reforms the army. He completely secures the borders and restores order to the local and central governments. And he took credit for everything that Tut built. And he was the last king of the 18th dynasty. So then, after that, obviously the 19th dynasty, right? And the first one we're going to talk about in the 19th dynasty is Ramses the First. He was an army officer appointed by Horemheb, but he only reigned for 2 years. He was the first king of the 19th dynasty. After him, we have the son of Ramses I, Seti I. He decides to rebuild the Egyptian empire, right? He looks at the past, he looks at how great things have been, and he's wanting to recreate as much of that as he can. So he sets out on a campaign to conquer Palestine. He reaches Syria and then starts running into conflicts with the Hittites. He loses ground and then gains some ground, but again, he never successfully holds on to much of it. And he just, kind of back and forth most of his reign. After him, you have his son, Ramses II. Ramses II is the longest reign in the history. He had 67 years. He died when he was about 80. He had many wives and many children, several different queens over the years, and one of them being Nefertari. It was his chief queen who he loved and respected greatly. He builds a special temple for her at Abu Simbel. It had its own beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Queens, okay? But he's also a master of propaganda. He claims that Amon was his real father and that large building projects were used to show his power. It basically gives everybody something to look at and shows how great he is and how powerful he is and how rich he is. And he builds what's called the Ramesseum, which is his mortuary temple. He also builds the Hypostyle Hall at Karnak and the temples of Abu Simbel. Those are all beautiful buildings that we can look at and study some more in other lessons. But he made other buildings that looked like he built them as well. Then he set out on different military campaigns as well. Because, like I said, he's trying to reclaim the old Egyptian empire, and he's continuing to try to reclaim it. And there's a battle at Kadesh that's fought by the Hittites or against the Hittites, and he's trapped by the Hittites. He was completely cut off from reinforcements, and he's trying to hold out. And eventually he does, and both sides withdraw. But he goes back and basically says, "Oh, it was a great victory. We won it. No problems." Even though it really was not a military victory, but he claimed it was. And, like we talked about earlier, he was great at propaganda, so he was able to sell it. So then he creates a treaty with the Hittites that gets signed, and he then marries one of the Hittite princesses. And his peace, because through this marriage, lasts until the end of his reign, until the Hittite kingdom collapses in 1196 BC. He also, during his reign, moves the capital closer to Palestine and Syria. It's Per Ramses, built on a site of the old Hyksos capital. And poets claimed it to be extremely beautiful, and it renamed the capital of the new kingdom. So at this point, the new kingdom is kind of coming to its end. It's never the same after Ramses II. It collapses within just a few decades, and then other kings try to once again to recreate his glory. The 20th dynasty kings often take his name, and so we get several different Ramses throughout history. This period of this 20th dynasty is dominated by kings named Ramses. Okay, and eventually it's the end of the new kingdom. Then we have Merenptah, who followed Ramses II, and he's forced threats to Egypt's security. Okay, it's the first threat was from the west in Libya, and he tried to settle they tried to settle in the Delta, and they're causing some problems. And then the second major threat he faces from the sea peoples of the Mediterranean. Eventually, he moves on to Ramses III, which is the 20th dynasty's second king, and he tried to be great, but he had a lot of problems. Again, he had the Libyan invasion, the sea peoples were attacking him again, and he lost a lot of the empire. Instead of being able to rebuild it, he lost quite a bit of it. He also had a labor strike. The people were getting tired of him and refused to work. They was trying to build a mortuary temple at the Medinah Habu, but it was poorly run. Again, the people were not wanting to have any part of it. They were failing to pay his workers, and they went on strike. And they believe this is the first recorded strike in all of history. He also had family problems. One of his wives leads a conspiracy to kill him and tries to replace him with their son. That's a bit of a family problem if your wife's trying to kill you. Also, so then he has a huge trial, and he finds many different people guilty, and he gets 17 of them and executes them. And many others had their ears and nose cut off, and just trying to save his kingdom the best he can, and more so his self than his kingdom. And we go down, like I said, multiple Ramses, and we go all the way down to Ramses the Ninth. And there's this tombs that get raided, and there's this huge scandal. And all during his time, the tombs are just getting ransacked and raided, and many of the tombs and even some of the royal tombs are being robbed. And the robbers would work in the local temples, and one of the people that they believed was the mayor of Thebes. And so, this just continued to go on, problems and problems. And so once again, under Ramses the Ninth, we have this huge trial. And unfortunately, nobody of importance is really found guilty. So, the mayor of Thebes, who was suspected, he doesn't get, found guilty. The priests weren't found guilty. But some of the lesser robbers were found guilty, and they were impaled. But it didn't solve any problems because the grave robbing continued, which is a problem. So some of the priests who weren't some of the crooked ones, are trying to save some of these things. They started moving some of the mummies to keep them safe. They're trying to save and preserve the bodies of these kings so that they could survive in the afterlife. And so they're moving them to different locations and not telling anybody about it. So during the 21st dynasty, many of the kings are moved, and they're hidden in little caches or little side parts of caves, and they found some of these in Deir al-Bahri, and they believe a couple of them are Ramses II and Seti I, hidden in the tomb of Amenhotep II in the Valley of the Kings, and that's where they think they found them. So ultimately, all through this time period is lots of chaos, lots of problems. No one, even though we have all these Ramses who are trying to bring back the greatness of the empire, they're failing miserably. And like I said, the final days of the kingdom, you have many different Ramses. None of the last kings were ever very strong. Nubia breaks away. The generals, the viziers, and the priests gain a lot of different power. And come the end of the 20th century, you have one of the generals ruling Egypt, and he takes the title of the high priest at Thebes. And so during that time, just, remember, it's a lot of chaos and a lot of Ramses. So make sure you read the material, and I'll see you again later.